All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. I am very excited to present our next guest. John Foley is a Nuffield scholar and senior seed production agronomist at PGW Seeds in New Zealand. And he is going to have a topic very near and dear to my heart. So I'm very excited to hear this presentation. And without further ado, I will pass it over to John and we can get rolling. You can share your screen.
Well, hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm John Foley, and I'm speaking today from a small town south of Christchurch in called Lincoln, in the South Island of New Zealand, so quite a long way away from you guys. But I must say the Johan's presentation I was just listening to was fascinating, and just shows the challenges that are out there for the I guess different countries and different people working in agriculture. So I really enjoyed that. So I'm just going to try and get my slides up. So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about science and innovation. I was going to do it in the context of New Zealand, which is probably where I spent most of my Nuffield scholarship year as well, because I was part of the COVID cohort, and so I was awarded my scholarship and had plenty of ambition to travel internationally, but our borders remained closed, so we ended up doing a lot of our scholar year in New Zealand. We did what was called the New Zealand World Tour, which was a trip through the country from the very north to the south, and over about 3 weeks as a group we visited around 50 farms, businesses, science institutions. And it was actually turned out to be, for myself, a really interesting experience, because a lot of my career I'd spent working up offshore for our company in South America, and so I never really had an opportunity to really get a deep dive into our agricultural sector. So it was sort of a silver lining for COVID in some ways. So I'll just move to the next slide, and I was going to just talk a little bit about what the Nuffield Scholarship is. And Ken and Johan have probably already talked a little bit about this, but it's a global rural leadership program, and it's sort of designed to link people internationally and to develop an understanding of other countries' challenges, and then bring those and opportunities to bring them home to your own home country. And so a guy called Lord Nuffield, he was a man who started the Morris Car Company in the UK. So he was a great benefactor to a lot of charities and education, and so he's founded the Nuffield Scholarship. I think it was in 1947. And so the New Zealand version started in 1950, and since then there's been about 177 scholars in New Zealand. So it's a well-established and long-running scholarship program. But the international side of it is probably the key aspect. So one of the things that we were able to do as a group once the borders opened up was participate in what's called the Global Focus Program. So in our cohort there was 70 scholars, and so we were split into 8 groups in sort of July and August of the last year. And so our scholar group was made up of people from New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, and Brazil. So we had the opportunity to travel, and our trip took us to Japan, Belgium, Ireland, and the United States. So it was a fascinating trip, and a really great privilege to visit some remarkable farms and agribusinesses and talk to a lot of very interesting people. So just as Ken and Johan was saying, so I thought about talking about what we're going to cover today, and sort of start quite high level. And these are sort of the main themes that came out of our tour, and I think they resonate with certainly with New Zealand farmers, and I'm sure it's the same in Canada. As there are some universal challenges, and so one of the key ones that we really honed in on is that there are less people linked with agriculture. a lot of people in their family histories, there is a family farm, but it's generations back now, and in highly urbanized societies, it's the link between our food producers and our consumers is on long supply chains.
John,
and
sorry to
yes,
interrupt. I don't think your slides are advancing on our side.
I will have another go. Apologies there. So we're back to with the global perspective, and the other thing we noticed, and we went to Brussels and we met some of the European Union's agricultural officials, and the thing that struck us was that in governments there's less people advocating or even agitating, for a better word, governments around agricultural policies. And so it's it's interesting, the people who are driving the policies didn't really have a direct connection to agriculture, and if we thought that was quite a problem effectively. So the consequences of it is farming and food is disconnected, and that's a challenge for creating value for farmers. The agricultural emissions, it's very true here in New Zealand with our potentially farming going into emissions trading scheme here. That's starting to be talked about in countries, certainly in Ireland is going down a similar route. The UK and other parts of the European Union are really going to struggling to deal with how farmers can potentially reduce their emissions and remain viable businesses. And so large agribusinesses becoming more dominant. And so I guess I'll put that last point in there, because my original idea for my Nuffield topic was actually looking into the contributions that family farms make to the agricultural sector. A huge number of people employed in in agribusinesses are the children of family farmers. And so there's this pipeline of people with a natural affinity for agriculture working in agribusiness. And so as our farms are getting larger and are consolidating, and families are stopping farming as it becomes more corporatized, there's a really important link that's going to be broken for people to have that affinity with the farming. And so I think it's a shame, and certainly when we're in the United States traveling, we saw a lot of that happening, especially in California. So yeah, it's a growing global trend. So in terms of New Zealand, some high level things just to give you some local context for where we're coming from. Agriculture in New Zealand, there's a real trend to try and create more value outside the farm gate. And so essentially what we've done for a generation or more is really focus on productivity and efficiency, but the environmental pressures, legislation, changing attitudes from about how we produce our food is meaning farmers and their cooperatives and agribusiness are really wrestling with this challenge. Is like, how can more value come from the value chain back to the farm? Traditional supply chains being disrupted. This is COVID. It's also New Zealand is one of the founding members of the WTO, and so we're seeing more trade barriers and make it more complexity for trading food internationally. And then the big challenge in the New Zealand context that I see is monetizing sustainability. So we've just done a free trade agreement with the European Union and the UK. Both those agreements have foundational clauses around sustainability of food production. And so to me, it seems like that's just a ticket to the table. To actually get value out of that is going to be quite a challenge. And so it's going to be a big cost to the sector to meet these requirements to get our food into high value markets, but we may not actually be remunerated for those efforts. And so we also have our red meat and dairy sectors, our largest agricultural sectors for New Zealand. There's a lot of local pressures, and so fresh water is a key discussion topic in New Zealand around water quality, about over intensifying our farms. So this is a problem that's been grappled with farming leaders, sectors, and the government. So there's a challenge there. And the last point, which I'd make, is just there's a general skills shortage. And so agriculture probably hasn't done a good enough job attracting new people into the sector. And there's a study done by Massey University and looking at the tenure of people in agriculture. So I was looking at horticulture and the seasonal workers as well. So it's a big cohort of workers, but the average time that somebody spent in agriculture in the period of the study was about 3 years. So there's a tremendous churn of workers going through the farming sector at the moment. So if you're constantly looking for staff, looking for skills, then it's very, very hard to shift your sector forward. So I pulled all this thinking in and into two things. So I think the two global challenges is one is value. So agriculture, I think it doesn't matter where you're farming, or where your agribusiness is, we need to create more value from using less and potentially more value from producing less. And that's certainly one of the messages in the European Union and with their Green Deal. Sustainability, it's reducing agriculture's environmental impact. Here in New Zealand, where we've had a change of government recently, but the previous government was about to put agriculture into an emissions trading scheme. So all farms in New Zealand had to know their emissions number. And so that was going to be benchmarked from 2025 onwards. And then you were going to have to pay for emissions. And so every farm was going to have an emissions reduction plan. So, these things are becoming quite real for us here. And then finally, it's also this urban, rural, disconnected food systems, the loss of local services and the sort of the movement of our population to large urban centres is really sort of disconnecting our food systems in New Zealand. So it's a challenge, so that our society sees farmers as a force of good and not just exploiting the land and sending a lot of food offshore. So these are the big themes. And thinking about all this, I've sort of came to the idea that applied research is absolutely critical to how we're going to achieve these challenges or add value. So and so from a New Zealand lens, it's quite difficult because we've been through quite a period of reforms, and our science system is not as strong as it was, and it's struggling and will struggle to deliver on these things. So what do we mean when we're talking about applied research? Well, essentially, if you think about science, it falls into two general camps. There's invention and innovation. Invention is what we associate science with. It's the people in the lab, maybe with the white coats and test tubes. They're creating new things and inventing new things. So that's the invention side of it. And then innovation is taking those ideas and applying them in different ways, and that's the applied research. And that's what agriculture worldwide has been massively successful with. And so the applied research models in farming, whether it's Canada or New Zealand or Uruguay, have just driven these incredible on-farm productivity gains, which have enabled us to produce food for a growing global population. So the types of research that we do and the systems we have are very, very complex. And so I had the opportunity to talk to a professor who introduced me to these two models to try and get my mind around what exactly are the challenges. And so I'll just walk you through these very quickly just to set the scene, I guess. So the first one is the three horizons model. And so a guy called Bill Sharp, he was a McKinsey consultant, came up with this in the 1980s. So it's a way of looking at transformative change. So if we're going to evolve our farm systems, our individual farms or our sectors, even the agricultural economies, you have a status quo and a future point. So if we look at the model, the green line, that's horizon 3, that's the future state. So if we use it, say, for instance, an apple orchard. So that green line could represent the transition to robotic fruit picking. So the robots technology is embryonic and it's being developed, but for sure we'll probably get there. And then the black line, that's our current orchard, and it's managed in its current way with labour, and the planting of the trees and everything is the same. And so the idea is then you've got to transition to a future, and this is the applied research. And so and that would be where you carry on managing the orchard in a broad sense the same way, but you start planting the new plantings of trees in anticipation for robotic planting. So that's the transition between one to the other. So, and essentially all industries, all businesses, they have this model. And so if you follow a transition to a future state, the robotic, that's what's called H2 positive. It's you're looking at evolving your businesses, and if you stay the same, then that's known as H2 negative, and that's where the status quo will just get reinforced and we won't actually shift the dial. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later, but essentially a lot of what we're doing in science in New Zealand is really sitting in that H2 negative space, where we're effectively doing similar things over and over without actually adding any capacity to tackle a lot of these future challenges. Second one is around the value. So remember we had the two things was, and so the value. So this is Pine and Gilmore. They came up with this model, and it's a really nice way of looking at agriculture, because we overwhelmingly see in New Zealand, we export commodities. So at the bottom left of the table, you'll see there's commodities, then moving up, making goods. That's your manufacturing, delivering the product into the market, and then the highest area is the experience, and that's where food becomes a force of good, or a entertainment, where it's eating in a restaurant or things like that. So the idea is that's the point of maximum value. And so commodities sit at the bottom left where it's lower value, and you move up. And so from New Zealand, most of what happens in our science bases happens in that commodities make goods in the shipping part, and then the value play is actually outside our market. And so it's quite interesting. In California, we saw went into a supermarket and they were selling New Zealand grass-fed beef. So this is a real-life example. So it was being sold on the grass-fed qualities as regen principles, and it was commanding a really nice premium. It was about 42 New Zealand dollars a kilogram. So when I got back to New Zealand, I back calculated the value. So the FOB price was $15, and then the value to the farmer was $8.50 a kilogram. So about 60% of or 65% of the final value of that beef was up in that experience and consumer quadrant. And so, like, the point is that there's a lot of the value in the supply chains of our commodities. It's just that they are sitting in places outside our domestic markets where they're produced. So the challenge for applied research and for our sectors is how we can get some more of that value back to farmers. So that were the two general models to frame the issue, and from a New Zealand point is a lot of what we do is focusing on farms or in markets and not in the in-market space, because it becomes very, very difficult to do that when we're not actively operating. And so science is a challenge, and I thought to lay the challenge down here was that in New Zealand we have good people doing good things competing against each other. And so we had a period of reforms, and we're just going to talk a little bit about that later, but essentially we brought competition to our science sector. So the Government Research Institute was broken up into competing entities. The universities were, the model was changed where they started competing against each other and with the new Crown Government Research Institutes. And the farming sectors themselves, they set up sector organisations to do their own research, and everybody was chasing a pot of government funding. So we developed a very competitive science sector, and the reality was a fully costed science model became too expensive for most farmers and businesses and private sectors to work with them. So we ended up in a situation of endless restructuring. It was quite in terms of New Zealand's scientific capacity, it wasn't a great outcome. So the context of it all was that in the 80s and 90s, these reforms were introduced to bring market forces in. The key part was that the government said that it would continue to supply the deep science, the invention stuff, and the applied research would have to be done by the private sector. And this model created a competitive framework, but it couldn't fund itself. And then so we ended up pricing the science beyond the reach of our farmers. So everything became efficiency and production focused. And I mentioned the competition, but probably the biggest thing that came out of it was, as the world globalized through that era, New Zealand domesticated science and innovation. We stopped doing the offshore stuff because that was also, not mandated, and no one took the overarching leadership to carry on doing those things. So we broke a lot of the linkages we had with international partners, and so it was more meat per hectare, more milk per hectare, more yield, completely focused on what we could control in our own market. So a very, very complicated situation, and so in terms of the government, I was trying to understand, how did this happen? And I met with all our ex-science ministers over the eras, and I ended up doing about 85 interviews with scientists. And the thing is that people would keep coming back to this issue is we know it's not working, but it's too big, too complex to fix. And this is this idea of a complexity paradox, is where no matter what we do, we actually make things worse for ourselves. And it's certainly the case for science in New Zealand. So the thing I thought was that where we did try to make changes, the government probably didn't have the expert capability to execute the change. And this is because, we've reduced our capabilities. A slim down government resonates with the voters. And there's a study I read out of the University College of London, where they looked at the cost of outsourcing, of using external consultants in Western governments, and the actual fact was around 40% greater using the outsourcing model versus maintaining in-house capabilities. And so what it means in reality is every time a government wants to make a major change, the pace of change slows down because they don't have the experts in-house to manage those changes. So governments really can't achieve a lot in the election cycle. So everybody becomes short of time, and it's all about the next election and what you can actually achieve. And science, even though people like science and they like to hear about science, and COVID really, I think the public's support of it really increased over that time, people don't vote for it. And the really good example is Malcolm Turnbull. He was the Australian Prime Minister, and he ran a election campaign in 2016 on the transformation of the science sector, of bringing the Australian economy into the 21st century. It was really aspirational stuff, and people liked it, but they actually didn't vote for it. And he just won the election. So the message from the electorate is, okay, that's really interesting, but there are other things that we're probably going to vote for. So, getting big change or reimagining or reforming these things becomes very, very difficult for governments. So for the science, we ended up this fragmented landscape. There's more than 50 science funds in New Zealand. And so the idea was it was meant to drive efficient use of research money. But in actual fact, we have the scientists living in a world where they need to get funding, to get published, to get funding, to get published. So they're on this sort of wheel, and they can't get off it. And it becomes quite destructive in a sense. In New Zealand, we publish more scientific papers per $1 million of science investment than any other country in the world. So you can see how the model is driving unintended consequences, because a lot of that science is behind paywalls, and it's actually published in offshore journals, and the scientists themselves are graded on what's on the impact. The H indice and the institute they work for also gets a ranking, and then that ranking helps them access government funding. So the model favors a publishing record versus an applied research record. So very few scientists in New Zealand will take the risk of doing genuine applied research and taking that knowledge from the publications from behind the paywalls into sectors and certainly into agriculture. And the other thing that's interesting about the whole publishing industry is that impact is measured on publishability. So high impact is in the highly read journals, and agricultural journals globally are ranked quite low. So we have the situation where agricultural scientists in New Zealand working for agricultural institutes, such as the government-run ones. We have two still, Plant and Food Research and Ag Research. They publish in pediatrics and other things because that gets your H value up, which then helps you get your funding. So there's a real disconnect of what we want from our science versus what we get because of this funding model. So consequences are really, in some ways, very obvious, but we've got a really management-intensive science environment in New Zealand. So you start off with your bid process for the funds. You write your bid process around the funds criteria, and essentially you're aiming for what you think that they will fund. And then you have a project, and the project has budgets. You've got to attract the people. Then you need to report on it, and if the project is successful, then the people jobs will probably be secure for a longer period of time. And if it's not successful, then that team breaks down, and everyone has to chase a new project and new funding. So what that means is we don't have long-term enduring science, and we also have a lot of projects that don't get finished. And so the outputs of those projects get stuck, and they end up on a shelf because it's uncompleted. So we have sort of a system that creates wastage, even though it is set up to create efficiencies. So the other concept I came up against was grantsmanship, and that's really what's channeling a lot of thinking, is actually becoming very good at writing bids, because attracting the funding is the all-important outcome rather than actually doing the science. And the next layer is that you end up having a science sector that play it safe, because securing funding is the critical outcome, because this funding pays the bills, and then having it safe means the project will be successful, and then a successful project equals career success. So hopefully I'm sort of articulating this, just how you get unintended consequences when you start off with something that was probably quite aspirational in terms of trying to make the use of science dollars more efficient. We've sort of created all these unattended issues inside the sector. And so one comment that I used as a quote on that last point was really, truly creative thinkers do not thrive in that environment. And I heard that from one of New Zealand's most senior scientists. And we've got this management intensive scientist is almost squeezing creativity out, because it's all around reporting, budgets, funds, bid processes, and less about being truly creative from a science point of view. And for farmers, this is the next layer we started is just the consequences of what it means when we have a disconnected science sector that's not doing the applied research great. And so it's expensive. I mentioned that there's a lot of duplication and silo behavior. So science really at its purest form and its most effective is a collaborative undertaking. The system we have doesn't encourage collaboration. So we have many institutions, many scientists solving the same problems in isolations, and it's because the funding is competitive, And so it works against the whole notion of collaboration. And farmers themselves are great collaborators. They're very applied people, and so it's a problem that they're not getting access to good ideas and good research coming into the sector. And so we've got a few challenges here, and it's going to be take quite a change in the thinking to actually figure out how this can be remodeled. Just two tables quickly, just to put in graphics what I was just talking about. So we have the new science, the invention side, and then in the New Zealand model that's going into our publications, and essentially it's not going any further. And so those publications, it's paywall, and it's almost like we're living in a loop of scientists publishing in places where scientists read the publications and publish, and so there's no output, or very little output, from that world into the wider economy and sectors. So what we're relying on mostly is old science and applied science and old technology and old innovation to create the new ideas. So that disconnected science sector is quite a challenge, but that is essentially what we have in New Zealand. Just a similar story. If you look at in terms of data integrity and relevance to farmers, so that the stuff that the government is investing is probably less relevant, but more pure science, and that's in our universities and our Crown Research Institutes, the government research entities, and the modelling. And so that's where we really do spend a lot of our science money. And then the gap, the dotted line to get it out into agriculture, it does require on-farm trials and case studies and working closely with the sector. And our major research entities really play very little role in that next step. And so it's fallen back to our levy-paying organisations, our sector groups, agribusinesses such as the one I work for, and farm consultants essentially to fill those holes. But to do it, we're not doing it at scale, and that's probably one of the challenges that we have. So it's that disconnect is also there. So having learned all that, and to be fair, it was absolutely fascinating talking to all these people, but nobody really had an answer. And although we've just had a change in government, the last one launched the big science review, and so they issued what was called a green paper to get industry and sector input. And I myself made a submission on it about how it could be reimagined or improved. And so they got thousands of submissions back, and it became too big a beast for them to handle, and they lost the election. So the potential reforms have stalled. But if you back it up, and it's what are the issues, and it's the issues aren't on farms, the issues are in our research institutions, but the problems are out of their control. And then the issues, are they back in the government? Well, the government themselves probably don't get a political mandate to make a big enacting change in science, plus the shorter time. And then you step back again, and it's the economic system that we've gone down that's probably responsible for what we've got. And I had talked to one about a government economist, and he likened what happened as an economic reformation, sort of a bit like what happened in Europe in the 16th century. So we threw out a lot of the old thinking, and we shifted our economic thinking and our paradigm. So we're living in this model that's actually becomes very, very hard to change. And so science sits in a pocket in this big kind of overarching ideology. And so we've got to really go higher and higher to try and figure out how we can make change. And I came across the concept of missions. And so missions have been quite topical at the moment. The European Union is using this kind of model to try and enact large changes across the EU. And so the European Green Deal, its agricultural policies are very much being defined in the mission-orientated innovation space. So it gets the name from the Apollo missions, and it's probably the most successful example as well. So it starts with, a grand vision. So John F. Kennedy, in 1963, he said that, by the end of the decade, Americans will be on the moon, and then the private sector swung in behind to deliver the Apollo missions, which were tremendously successful. So hence the name mission-orientated innovation. And so there's a few kind of key things, and it's around what a mission is, and it's they are determined by consensus, and so once they're identified, the goals are developed, and then you set down a path to build collaboration at scale. So between public and private sectors, it's probably the key thing that we require in a mission, is that the governments will stop being an interested bystander and become more active. And of course, our small government model and thinking in the market-orientated world, that's kind of something that's maybe not comfortable for a lot of people to think of, but we're effectively saying that they need to get back involved, rebuild their capabilities, and start acting as an enabler for these big challenges. So a good example of what a mission could be is around climate change and building resilient agricultural systems in any country for a climate change future. So the key other thing is, they are enduring, and they aren't silos or pet projects, so that it does require a lot of discipline from government and incoming governments and changes in government not to tinker the model or shift the goalposts. So these are just like the Apollo mission was a long-term enduring program. It's exactly what a mission is. So I just put this in. It's probably a graphic. It's complicated, but try and just highlight exactly what it is. So you have your grand challenges. So it could be climate resilient systems. The mission is is the overarching goal, and then you bring the sectors in, and you can have multiple sectors. So in farming, it would be, for instance, in New Zealand, it could be the red meat sector, the dairy sector, and our grains and seeds all working together. And then you have a whole series of mission projects. And of course, the way these projects are run and coordinated would depend, but certainly the outputs, the involvement is the private sector. The private sector can still pursue their profit motive. So it's not a sort of a socialist construct. It's everybody has a place to play, but the fundamental point is this is a collaborative model. So you don't have the silos and the cross-sector competition. The model should work to eliminate those things. So the mandate becomes for the greater good. And so it's a pretty powerful model, but the reality is it takes a big change in the thinking, to actually enact such a change and at scale. So in my Nuffield project, I propose this as a potential solution to our fragmented and competitive science sector. And from that, I suggested 3 missions, which I actually submitted in my submission to the government for their science reforms. But the 3 areas for us as missions was re-engaging at an international level with our researchers and business people, and that was trying to get closer to that point of highest value on that model, Pine and Gilmore's model. And then the next one was creating the opportunities for technological convergence. So the convergence of ideas is an interesting concept in relation to applied research. And so probably one of the best examples I can think of is aerial top dressing. Or fertilizer. So at the end of the Second World War, New Zealand had quite a lot of ex-RAF pilots come home, and they were looking for jobs, and a few of them started experimenting with aircraft putting fertilizer on fields. And so that was the aircraft had developed to the point where that was possible. We actually had pilots, highly skilled pilots who could do it. And the mercantile firms and farmers could see the opportunity. So the aviation sector globally, grew out of New Zealand from those guys that came back from the war, but it needed needed a lot of factors all to converge at once to make it possible. And that's the idea of technological convergence. So you need what's called a translator. So a translator is a person who can see the opportunity and break it down into something that's can be applied and understood in a broader sense. And you need the second aspect of the convergence is the absorptive capacity, and that's the farmers and the agribusinesses, where that they are willing and capable of taking on new ideas. So in terms of farming, certainly in this country, it's been relatively easy to intensify your farm because we've always been working within the same construct. It's been a dairy farm. We've been putting more cattle per hectare or increasing milk solids per cow. It's in the same, it's broadly similar. So making change in those systems has been quite simple. But as we move into environmental sustainability, as I said earlier, is there a prize for sustainability in markets, and how we're going to do that? So we need to build people in our supply chains and value chains who are capable of making the organizations they work for absorbing the ideas to make those changes. So, it's a special type of person was required. So that was the thinking there. And the third idea in terms of the missions was, pushing the sector back into, a larger overeating agricultural institute and making the world leading. So taking those silos out, removing that unhealthy competition that exists, and sort of trying to not bring the past back, because the past model wasn't perfect either. It did need reforming, to be fair, but trying to reimagine it as building back better. So they were the three missions. So quite a cool concept, quite complicated. The Irish government is actually using missions, and they're using incubating ideas through citizens forums to come up for what they could be. And so they're looking at social issues, and we'll try and use the mission model to fix things like housing and access to nutritional food. And so they're engaging groups to try and see what they look like. With everything, there are limitations. It's probably always good just to highlight those, so the guiding principle of missions is to tilt the playing field towards the common good, but who decides what the common good is? And that's probably one of the things where the Irish model with the citizens forums is probably a good one, because you'll get consensus. But if you have government ministers or lobbyists or things like that in there deciding what that is, then right from the start, you're going to have a misalignment, and then this enduring nature of the mission will never get off the ground because it won't have broad support. And then, if it's not done well, we'll just change the model, we have the same problems, and that's a real risk. Certainly in the European Union with their Green Deal, this looks like this is exactly what's emerging. So, and the war in the Ukraine has slowed down their adoption of some of that Green Deal modelling, but it's certainly become quite politicised and controversial. And if you go out to the citizens, if they want something different to the government of the day, that's going to be a challenge, because you still need the government buy-in to sort of to be the enabler of the missions. And the next point, really, top talent requires top remuneration. The state sector salaries are always contentious. It doesn't matter which country you're in. So are a society prepared to pay for top talent? And that's a real challenge as well. And if the mission fails, who's accountable? So if the government of the day are there when the mission fails, they're not expected to interfere with it, let the mission run its course. But for sure, the electorate will hold them accountable. So that's probably one of the difficult things around it too. So my last slide was really just some conclusion. So it's a big topic, really complicated. I actually thoroughly enjoyed looking at it. It just surprised me just how dysfunctional at some levels it was. But in saying that, it's actually full of good people, and it's a very frustrating place to work if you're a scientist. And it's remarkable that so many good people have hung in there for the long term. But the reality is society has grand challenges, and we are going to have to try and think about how we do things differently. And so if I just straight off the top, from a New Zealand point of view, climate change is an issue. The east coast of the North Island has had the 3 wettest years in the last 3 years, including one major cyclone that decimated our horticulture sector. You know, these are big, real problems. You know, we have a unbelievably, for a nation that with 5 million people that exports enough food to feed 40 odd million people, we actually have food poverty in our urban communities, you know, so it's another challenge we need to come up with. And then we have the geopolitics. You know, there's layers of things that are big challenges for us. So we have to do something, and we have to reimagine what that could look like. So, you know, we've seen that we've got a complex science sector. It's fragmented and competitive. In the model that we have, it's become very localized and difficult to scale. So ideas that sit in one sector are not easily transferable to others because they've been developed very specifically. Everyone's short of time. That was one thing I learned and realized, that the scientists are short of time. Their projects are time limited. They have to publish for their H indices, their rankings. The government of the day are putting in new ideas and defunding the previous ones. And so everything sort of boils down, in my mind, to almost election cycles. In New Zealand, it's only 3 years. So, you know, everybody's on this treadmill of trying to get output out fast, get things published, and then chase the next funding cycle. So that is quite a destructive place to be when we're trying to solve the big challenges. And you know, like I say, what is possible is locked in the current economic paradigm. So we fundamentally, whatever we do, you know, we have to bring this idea of collaboration and enduring nature back into not only science but into our society. And it's what's probably quite an interesting just point to touch on is that, you know, the lifespan of organizations is shortened over the decades. So I think it was in the 1960s, a company listed on the Dow Jones index had an average lifespan, I think it was around 60, might be 50 or 60 years. And so you come forward to the day, that's down to 14 years. So everybody's time horizons have narrowed, and this makes doing enduring science and long-term projects very, very difficult. And one of the reasons is, obviously, I've mentioned the economic systems, but short-term reporting. So quarterly reporting for businesses is shortening the horizons of business, and then stage reporting in science projects. It means that we're always only aiming for the end of the current time period. So it's quite a challenge for us to try and shift the model to start thinking long term again. And it was really interesting. All my Nuffield travels in those countries I visited, but also in the successful companies in New Zealand that do the R&D space really well, is they've never lost the long term. They continue enduring, and they invest in long-term science. And because the projects that they're investing in are long-term, it actually shapes the attitudes and the cultures of the senior management team in those teams in those organizations. So it's not that they become conservative and play it safe. It's just that they take long-term decisions for the greater good of the organization, because the R&D that they're funding needs it. So that's probably the last key point I'd like to discuss. And so I think that's all I had. I just had a thank you slide, and yeah, happy to take some questions.
All right. Thank you, John, so much for that presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think I speak for many of us in the room that they also did as well. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So John is asking for some comments on getting the question right on the goal or mission. Is it a prerequisite for the mission? And a goal is critical to get government/societal support.
Yeah, that's right. The framing the missions is critical because it has to be aspirational and it has to resonate. And so, and I think that's still, you know, when you're thinking about it, doing a mission in science, you know, I think it's getting that broad-based buy-in is difficult. It has to be something that people can immediately connect with, and then justify the next step of building the mission behind it, because you are going to be throwing a lot of resources and money at it, and there is that lag of bringing the mission online, so to speak. So that's a fundamental building block of it. So it's a great question. It was really, really interesting. When we think about the context of missions, and we had some really interesting meetings with some of the European Union agricultural people in Brussels last year, and they were talking about the Green Deal. So, and because this is probably how you can kind of get it a little bit wrong, is so aspirationally there's a target around organic food production in the European Union, and the idea is that people like the idea of less input agriculture. There's less potentially impacts on freshwater, for example. So, and society likes that. Urban people like it and that. But then when they went wider and they started, putting these goals out there, the organic farming sector in the European Union hated the idea, because they trade on a premium. So if you're going to shift the agricultural model to an organic mass market, the premium would evaporate. And so, all the efforts building these, really, really successful organic farming and enterprises, would be unpicked by going to that model. So that was a probably example where they had an aspirational goal, but they didn't do the connecting to the society and into the farming sector properly.
Okay, perfect. And Scott, you had a follow-up question?
Yeah, I think actually, like, very similar to John, is that I think you could have a great, or I guess, yeah, getting the right mission or getting the right goal is the first thing. Because what I'm seeing is, did you see this morning's, well, I guess it'd be different whether it was morning or I'm not sure what time it is for you, but earlier for us, the cover crops. And a lot of times
It's very early in the morning right now for John. Okay. He woke up especially early to present. It's actually tomorrow for him.
I was kind of thinking that, yeah.
Yeah, he did not see.
You can ask me the lottery results. I'm in the future.
But it seems like the goal is to use cover crops, but then a lot of the research and a lot of our local experience has been that they just don't seem to, they don't seem to work here, or they're like, there's very specific points where they are successful, but that's where I think like the mission could be a problem if you get into, the goal is to get cover crops implemented, because it just doesn't seem to, we're so limited in our rainfall here and water. So
yeah, I completely agree, Scott. And that's probably, comes back to, we come up with these grand statements, and politicians have to get elected. And I listened to an interview with one of our now ex-ministers here, and he let it slip that his most important thoughts about his role was to get re-elected, which went down quite badly in the media. But he's just been completely honest. So, and I guess the takeout is that they're making grand statements that try and resonate with society, but the reality is what needs to be done is further down and much more practical. So the cover crops example is a great one, because you need agronomists and plant physiologists and people like that to do the field work to see what the adaptability of these potential species that cover crops are. So making a grand statement and then pushing starters is always going to, be a challenge or not turn out right. And of course, that then undermines everyone's confidence in everything. So, if you're going to do these things, you have to do it really, really well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge to try to get, because trying to come up with a mission is like society might have a mission that, like I think the organic one is a really good one. If they think that everybody wants organic, or that they want to get everything to organic, but then that doesn't really fit with, with farming practices and the existing farmers that are trying to make it work. So
Yeah, it did right. Yeah. And the mission thing is interesting because everyone's talking about it. It became a bit of a hot topic after, during COVID. It's like, like everybody, the Western economies, they're all talking about how we're going to get our economies back on track, and there's an opportunity to do things better. And I remember at the time there's a lot of discussions, even around what missions could look like, and essentially, as far as very few of them have ever gone further than discussions, because it's a difficult thing to get your head around, especially this. I guess is we got to keep stepping back to the point that you can understand the whole picture to launch these things, and we didn't do it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, John, for your presentation and sharing your experiences with us. Truly appreciate it. And I would like to also thank our sponsors. So Syngenta and Metos Canada supported us this year. And we'll move on next to Andrew Werrett.